Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast presenting Cuba news and commentary from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott. I'm here with Samantha Hislop and Robert Crooks. Today, we wanted to follow up on the robust international response to the sanctioning of Cuba's medical missions. So I believe that Robert has some quotes and perspectives of that larger community that we can share and discuss for this week's episode.
Yeah, exactly. So, thanks to some of the work of the journalists out there, we've gathered a bunch of quotes from regional leaders in response to this move by the U.S. government. So Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, said, I quote, "If we cannot reach a sensible agreement on this matter and the cost of it is the loss of my visa to the U.S., then so be it. We could not get through the pandemic without the Cuban nurses and doctors. What the Cubans have done for us, far from approximating itself to human trafficking, has been to save lives and limbs and sight for many a Caribbean person." Close quote. The Barbadian ambassador to CARICOM, David Commission, said the following, quote, "We are sovereign independent nations, and we will decide for ourselves what nations we will have relations with." Close quote. He then went on to characterize Marco Rubio's current policy as, quote, "part of this continuing U.S. vendetta against Cuba aimed at regime change." He then went on to say that the United States, having withdrawn itself from the Pan American Health Organization, will have a tremendous implication for all of us in the Caribbean, and you now turn around and say we must reject the much-needed and critical health assistance being given to us by Cuba? Close quote. Keith Rowley, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, said, quote, "We rely for our health care delivery on specialists mainly from Cuba. Out of the blue, now we are being called human traffickers because we hire technical people who we pay top dollar equal to local rates. I just came back from California, and if I never go back there in my life, I will ensure that the sovereignty of Trinidad and Tobago is known to its people and respected by all." Close quote. Ralph Gonsalves, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, said, quote, "I know we're not involved in any exploitation of Cuban workers. Without the Cubans, we would not be able to offer the hemodialysis we do in St. Vincent for 60 persons. So does anybody expect that I, because I want to keep a visa, that I would let 60 persons from the poor and working people die? It will never happen." Close quote. Deacon Mitchell, the Prime Minister of Grenada, said, quote, "We have a legitimate partnership with the government and people of Cuba who have over several decades provided support to the people of Grenada in the medical field. We will continue to support and defend the partnership." Close quote. Gaston Brown, the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, said, quote, "We totally reject the notion that we are involved in any form of human trafficking. These Cuban doctors and nurses represent the core of our healthcare service. If they were to take any punitive action against Caribbean countries because of the involvement of Cubans, they will literally dismantle our healthcare services and put our people at risk. This extraterritorial positioning, articulation, and threats, I don't know that this is the route we need to go." Close quote. And finally, Jamaica's Foreign Minister Kamina Johnson-Smith emphasized this reality at a recent press briefing, noting that her island hosts more than 400 Cuban medical professionals, including doctors, nurses, biomedical engineers, and technicians whose services are, quote, "of importance to our healthcare system," close quote. Pretty serious stuff. That says a lot about how much people of the region, of the Caribbean region, rely on the healthcare services of Cuba, and that the policies of Marco Rubio and the United States government is going to have real life-threatening effects on these countries, and these leaders are standing up and saying, we will gladly protect the people of our countries rather than having the privilege to go to California on vacation, as Ralph Gonzalez of St. Vincent and the Grenadines said.
And these are perspectives from countries whose very well-established friendships with Cuba span decades. I think that the swiftness of this response and the strength of this response has to do with a dynamic that we've flagged many times over, that these countries are being indirectly sanctioned and directly impacted by the U.S. line as well. Not only is the U.S. meddling in their ability to establish nation-to-nation relationships, and this is a major respect in which the blockade contravenes international law and obliges everybody to this U.S. line, but also these are countries that at various points have relied upon medical missions and an influx of Cuban specialists supported by the Cuban government as a lifeline. Barbados had a crucial health cooperation agreement for 69 Cuban personnel at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't know, I don't rightly know. I don't think that they have so many doctors at this moment. But, this agreement between the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados and Cuba's Ministry of Public Health was acknowledged as the crucial factor in getting Barbados through the COVID pandemic. And we all know Cuba's record on this. I think that that's one of the reasons for the strength of those remarks. Mm-hmm. And it's good to hear people respond quickly too, because you look at like Trinidad and Tobago, which began its relationship with the Cuban medical brigades in 2003 and has received really robust support, including the sort of long-standing commitments that we've talked about. There was a delegation of 30 nurses and 6 doctors at the outset of this exchange, but then they were distributed through regional health authorities and offered a lot of support ongoingly, right? And if you read about the history of Cuban specialists, hematologists, and neurosurgeons, and so on in Trinidad and Tobago, that's interesting. But there are right-wing and Trumpist elements in that government too. There's a right-wing parliamentarian and former health minister, Fuad Khan, who has come down very, very strongly against this premise and says that the dependence on Cuban doctors is discouraging the training up of professionals in Trinidad and Tobago, and that he hadn't seen it through this lens until Trump's rhetoric began, but that it seems to him to be a problem, the dependence of Trinidad and Tobago on Cuban doctors. So there are reactionary elements in these governments too that are more susceptible to the Trump line. So it's great to hear this swift response from the CARICOM leaders. Well,
it's interesting that, you talk about the issue of dependence on Cuban medical brigades. Cuba's medical brigades have been praised by like the World Health Organization, for example, specifically for contributing medical care that does not create dependence, because Cuban doctors go in there and they set up the infrastructure that people need for healthcare. They also have what we talked about a couple episodes ago, the ELAM, the Latin American School for Medicine, which specifically educates medical professionals from countries like the ones in the Caribbean that need, I guess, like native doctors and nurses and specialists, etc. But even these sanctions that the U.S. is trying to introduce, like, it has such widespread implications, because part of the way that Cuba's able to contribute this level of healthcare is, sometimes, countries pay on the basis of whether they're able to or not. And there was a recent study I saw that something like just under half of the countries pay nothing for the medical care that they receive or the medical attention they receive from Cuban doctors and nurses. And in some cases, in order to pay for these services, because obviously Cubans have to pay their doctors, they have to pay for all the expenses of medical care, but sometimes the way they pay this is through like a triangulated collaboration where a third party will help to fund the Cuban doctors. And these third parties can be like the United Nations, or it could be other governments that collaborate with the Cuban government. And in the past, this has included like the British government, who paid for Cuban doctors to go to South Africa, and France also has paid for Cuban doctors to go to their former African colonies. So even the U.S. restrictions will affect that triangulation as well. So it's really widespread and horrendous act by the United States government.
I think we should emphasize too. You mentioned ELAM, the Latin American School of Medicine in Cuba, and that's why I think it's really not a valid claim at all to claim that Cuba's this medical internationalism and these missions and brigades are creating a dependency, because if it is the case in a country where they are not able to educate and train their own doctors domestically, then they can send their students to Cuba to get educated for free. Other countries do that. That's not a valid or fair claim to make, that it's creating a dependency, because Cuba is also offering education so that people can go back to their underserved communities. They've been doing that essentially since the triumph of the revolution. So that's false, really.
And also like this idea that this is somehow Cuba's like insidious way to get in good with other countries, so that they'll fall into like Cuba's sphere of influence, and then they can use them as, I don't know, some like international army to attack America or something, which is so ridiculous when you look at where Cuba sends doctors, right? It sends doctors and medical professionals to the countries that have like the least amount of influence internationally. And also Cuba bases its sending of brigades on like not on political or like institutions. Like it doesn't only cooperate with countries that agree with it politically. Like it goes there to help the people. Like it doesn't go there to help governments. It goes there to help the people of those countries. And sometimes the governments are very welcoming, but sometimes the government, or at least forces in the government, can be quite hostile to the Cubans. So that is also like another claim that you hear that just has no basis in reality.
That's like when Bolsonaro was president in Brazil, when he canceled the program and when he basically kicked out all of the Cuban doctors. And there were like tens of thousands of indigenous Brazilians that were completely devastated. There was interviews you could see of them crying, saying, before Cuban doctors came, I had never seen a doctor in my life. And suddenly the Cubans came and I had a regular doctor that I could see whenever I wanted to. And now they're forced to leave and I'm going to have no doctor again. So all of these rural communities, especially, they suffer the most in like remote areas, the most marginalized. They're always the ones that suffer the most if they don't have access to these programs or these services. And that was totally political too when Bolsonaro did that. He wasn't putting his people first.
And and another thing that I think that should be understood, a lot of the countries in the CARICOM network that benefit really directly from Cuban medical internationalism, and it's not just this part of the world. Of course, there's 25,000 doctors, perhaps more. I don't know, give or take, abroad. Mm-hmm. One really important thing is that these countries all have something in common. There was a flurry of articles, and you can still read them today, but I recall seeing them across a wide range of platforms of very different perspectives on the specific problem of brain drain as it bears on Jamaica, where half of the country's medical professionals have left. They have like 0.7 doctors per 1,000 people right now, or something really verging on a terribly acute crisis. So even if you canvass what you can glean of popular opinion from newspapers and so on, people greet the proposal to sanction the medical missions with horror, because they see really firsthand that the Cuban mission in Jamaica is supplementing a social catastrophe, and that catastrophe is instigated by the United States as well. It's different from the medical professional parole programs by which they target Cubans. It's different, but it's still a similar dynamic where they lure people by way of like global wage scaling and so on away from their own countries, and they deplete the intellectual and practical resources of the region. So, in this respect, Cuba is also bolstering, and this is why I don't like the narrative coming from certain, I don't know what, opposition elements in Trinidad and Tobago and so on, Dr. Khan, because Cuba is bolstering the sovereignty of these countries, and in no way depleting it by training people up and sending specialists where there are acute shortages.
Right.
That needs to be placed in this larger context too, where the similarities between these islands are the reason for the pangs of recognition that you see facing a threat like this.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point, Cam. It's not even just about the fact that these countries can or cannot, that they do or do not have the resources to train their own medical personnel, but it's exactly the brain drain that you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So the United States, from 2006 to 2017, they had the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program. And what that was, that targeted Cuban doctors and nurses, healthcare professionals that were on missions. It was a targeted visa program. And basically, if you were a Cuban medical professional in some other country on a medical mission, you could apply for a visa to come and reside in the United States, abandon your mission, abandon your country and your responsibilities, and come get residency and live in the United States. So they were poaching, and most Cuban doctors and healthcare professionals, they don't abandon their missions, but some are lured by the money and the special treatment that they receive as immigrants in the United States. In order to discredit this program, they were luring some professionals to the United States, and of course, when these doctors or nurses get to the U.S., they don't have to jump through all of the hoops that other immigrant doctors from other countries would have to in order to continue or to start practicing as a healthcare professional in the U.S. We know, in Canada, for example, there are people highly skilled and educated, whether it's in science and engineering or the medical profession, but they're working. They're not working as healthcare professionals in Canada, despite our major shortage of doctors. They might be driving or delivering or doing something, but they're not using their skills or capacity that they have. And residents of Canada, our problems aren't being solved either. But Cubans that go to the U.S., they get fast tracked. There's all kinds of programs available, CFRP. Especially in Florida specifically. Most of them end up in South Florida. It's just fairly seamless, basically, for them to just start up and kind of start working again. There's not so much concern about equivalencies in like licensing and all these hoops that other people would have to jump through when you move to a new country. Cubans don't have to do that. They get special treatment. That's intentional. And then they become these poster children for, the American dream. Doctors should be able to enrich themselves in a privatized healthcare system. They deserve it. They should be making good money, really good money, at the expense of the public health and general population. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a targeted program, targeting these doctors on these missions that they were doing. And that was for over 10 years that they were doing that. And that's a very overt brain drain operation, in my opinion.
And it's an economic drain too, right? Because like we've talked about it, like the Cubans have like one of the most advanced medical systems in the world. They have one of the best like medical educations in the world. And so they're pouring all of these resources into training doctors and nurses and what have you. Yeah. And then they're, like you said, they're being poached and ending up in South Florida where they're like, also, I think you were saying this, like they're isolated from the realities of living in the United States and living in the capitalist world, where they don't see the type of poverty that exists in these countries. Yeah. And so they're as you say, they're perfect poster people for the American dream, because they think, it's all I had
to do was apply for a visa, and I'm a doctor, and now I'm here. Yeah. I've got a huge house, a great business. I'm a plastic surgeon, or I'm a orthodontist, or whatever, making more money than I ever thought I could make. And mm-hmm. you can do it too if you live in the U.S., but not if you live in Cuba. I guess they buy into it, right? Because they get really special treatment.
And ideologically, it's worth pointing out the irony that the Cuban Adjustment Act and these parole programs and so on, whatever means by which residency is not just fast-tracked, but migration is solicited, right, by these preferential policies. These are signature policies of otherwise terribly xenophobic governments that want to close the borders and shut down immigration. But in this one respect only, they are solicitous of Cuban specialists, because that's actually two faces of the same project, right?
And they'll do everything to discredit the Cuban medical system, the health system. But all these healthcare professionals that are Cuban are more than good enough to come here and work immediately as soon as they get here. They're fully qualified, which they are. But it's incoherent, because if they don't have an adequate or respectable or admirable system there, then why are you so quick to scoop up their healthcare professionals?
Yeah, I was reading an interesting paper about this, and I actually can't recall where I found it, so I won't. As you know, you have to do this with like English language scholarship. I don't want to stick my neck out too far for whomever wrote it, because I'm not really sure their political commitments. But it was a really interesting sort of comparative analysis of like the U.S. and Cuban outlay on international medical aid, and it was trying to sketch the backdrop to the parole program that you were speaking of, and they made this really interesting point. They quoted Obama actually as saying that, I wish I could reconstruct this quote, that the positive appraisal of Cuba by so many of these countries might have to do with the fact that people encounter Cuba in the guise of medicine, and they encounter the United States in a military aspect. He just said straight up, like, he basically reiterated the Fidel quote, that Cuba sends doctors and the U.S. sends bombs. Yeah. Except that this is Obama being like, shucks, like maybe we should try something different. And we all know that didn't go terribly well. And also that Obama was only proposing to meddle by other means, right? Yeah. But this comparative analysis of U.S. medical aid versus Cuban medical aid, it occurs to me now, also points up not only a strength of the Cuban approach, but why it is uniquely susceptible to these kinds of prejudicial sanctions, which is that the United States, their medical outreach is based on capital expenses. Mm-hmm. And the Cuban approach is labor intensive. Cuba sends personnel, you know? They send people to physically attend scenes of disaster and privation and so on. And they don't do it in the guise of quite literal investment, which is the U.S. approach, you know? I think that strength of the Cuban program is also why they can malign it as human trafficking, and they can try to restrict the movements of individuals and sanction their families and so on, is because it actually transpires by way of the interpersonal and by physical attendance of these scenes. So, you know, when I think about it like that, it actually seems far more hateful in a way.
Yeah.
I wonder when that Obama quote is from, because like there was a speech given by Fidel in 2008 called "The Ant and the Elephant," which is a really fantastic speech, and I believe he's delivering it to students at Elam, and where he says, "What does the empire decide to do in order to compete with Cuba in our hemisphere? Send a huge ship converted into a floating hospital that works for 10 days in each country? A number of people can be helped, but it's far from solving a country's problems. It doesn't compensate for the brain drain, nor can it train the specialists needed to provide real medical services any day of the week or year." That sums it up pretty well.
Yeah, and like it's really interesting. This is related to Cuban medical missions. There was a mission in Venezuela called Operation Milagro, Operation Miracle, where they restored eyesight to millions of Venezuelans who otherwise wouldn't have been able to undergo the necessary surgical procedure. Most of it was like cataract surgery. And, you know, most people in the world that are blind are in the global south, and and it's due to malnutrition and also a lack of access to simple surgical procedures. So when like you were saying about like not actually, the US can't even like conceive of actually trying to solve the real root causes and the problems that people face and their health issues and related issues. With Operation Milagro, what they noticed was what actually preceded that was a literacy program, because they wanted to go and help. The Cubans were going to send a mission for Yo Si Puedo, Yes I Can, the Yes I Can program, to teach millions of Venezuelans to read. And a huge issue was that a bunch of these people, a very good chunk of them, were legally blind, and they needed surgery. It could be corrected, but they were blind. So you can't learn if you're illiterate, you have to be able to read if you need to learn how to read. So that's kind of where Operation Milagro came from. So like they want to solve the real problems. They want to help people. Like that's the basis of everything. And I think we should just give a shout out right now to Cuba too, because this year Honduras is going to be declared free of illiteracy because of the Yo Si Puedo program. More than 4 million people in Honduras in the last 2 years have learned to read and write. That's an amazing accomplishment. So I just wanted to add that in for anybody who's not aware of it too. So
it's incredible.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. And that particular program that you're speaking of, the literacy program, was offered really to the world, the Yes I Can method. There was a proposal that, were it rolled out correctly, maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong, they could cure, end global illiteracy for a budget of, like $1.5 billion or something very, very modest. It seems like a remarkable pedagogical method that gets real results in. I wish I knew more about what it consists in terms of phonetics and so on, because it seems like, even in terms of gains for adult literacy, there's people who make remarkable progress in like 3 or 4 months. It seems like probably one of the best implemented and best designed literacy programs ever.
Yes.
Well, it's so interesting too, because like I think we can look at the United States and their sort of attempt to, crush all these amazing programs that Cuba is trying to carry out across the world as like just evil, which, yes, that's kind of accurate. It is just evil, but it's also has to do with like capitalism and the fact that all of these things have to be commodified. And if Cuba's just going around the world, like you said, like curing blindness, teaching people how to read, then like how do you make money off of medical services? How do you make money off like education? And so it's really like this systemic insidiousness of capitalism that almost forces, I guess Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, they're like personally vile people, but it's really this systemic thing that is like forcing the capitalist world to try to crush what Cuba is trying to provide to the world. And like just to like, I don't want to like just shoot off a bunch of numbers, but just to give like an idea of the sort of vast scope of Cuba's programs. There was a Venezuelan scholar, Henry Morales, who, because Cuba's not very forthcoming with like all like the numbers of these programs, because they do it for like the good of the world. But Henry Morales tallied this up, and he said that based on his calculations between 1999 and 2015, Cuba spent $71.5 billion on these medical assistance programs. That's 6.6% of its GDP annually. In comparison, the European average is 0.39% of GDP. The United States is 0.17%. And this is, during the same period, the U.S. blockade cost Cuba $4 to $5 billion annually during this period. And during that same period, Cuba was able to save 6 million lives, carried out 1.39 billion medical consultations, 10 million surgical operations, attended 2.67 million births, and 73,848 foreign students graduated as professionals from ELAM.
And yeah, that's why they try to crush all this with sanctions, because on its own terms, the two systems, it's very clear which one produces real results for people. And that's socialism. So that's why we have all these sanctions. And that's why now we have, these threats of revoking visas, denying visas for, countries and diplomats and officials that collaborate with Cuba in these programs.
And we should be very aware of this in Canada, because, we like to tout our universal healthcare system as so great, but, Pierre Poilievre is meeting with like private healthcare or like insurance healthcare providers in the United States. I don't think Mark Carney will be much hope in saving our healthcare system. It was the Trudeau Liberals that were praising some of the privatization that was happening in Ontario under Doug Ford. So, this just goes to show you that there is a different way to approach healthcare. And, there's so much talk about U.S. influence in Canada these days, but it's so insidious that we're allowing this, allowing our quality of life to just slide, because we're still better than the U.S. It's like, how much longer are we even going to be able to say that, right?
Let's not forget too, during the height of the COVID pandemic, there were Indigenous communities in Manitoba. They were in a crisis. People were dying and in very critical condition, and they didn't have hardly any medical personnel. And the Canadian government, the provincial government, weren't doing anything about it. So under, exercising their sovereignty, their leaders went to Cuba, and they had meetings with the Ministry of Health in Cuba and the government of Cuba. And they came to agreements. They signed contracts for Cuban doctors to come and serve their communities. which are remote, which most doctors in Canada who are doctors don't want to live in those remote communities. And secondly, access to education for Indigenous people in this country is abysmal. They don't even get to pursue that education to work in their own community. So they needed doctors. They came to an agreement as sovereign nations, and Chrystia Freeland came out and said, nope, we will not grant visas to these doctors to enter Canada. It's not necessary. Canada has a great healthcare system. You don't need them. You don't need them. We don't need them. We can take care of this ourselves. But nothing was done about it. Nothing changed, obviously. So it was a violation of sovereignty and human rights, because those people really needed that care. So I think we need to really work on awareness in Canada of what's happening, what's been happening. And we should not be optimistic at all about our own healthcare system and where it's headed.
Well, where those tremendous regional disparities were concerned as well, characteristically, a major part of the agreement that Southern Chiefs organization here in Manitoba had with Cuba was training. Cuban doctors would train Indigenous...
I didn't know that detail.
Yeah. I think that also some Albertan First Nations, but that they would go and train in Cuba, then to return and practice in their own communities, which is a very important facet of Cuba's medical missions abroad. So it's terribly straightforward in a sense that these communities were also being blockaded by the Canadian state alongside the Canadian participation in the U.S. blockade of Cuba.
I think I think this is an area where the Cuba Solidarity Movement in Canada can try to play a role too, is facilitating this educational exchange, and seeing if we can't help people from marginalized communities, underserved communities, remote communities in Canada, these students to get training at the Latin American School of Medicine in Havana on scholarships, because it's obscenely expensive and it's very gate-kept, the medical profession in Canada across the provinces. Cuba Solidarity in Canada should really look at that, and facilitating those relationships and help to get something going there maybe.
This whole story reminds me a lot of when Cuba was ready to send doctors to New Orleans during Katrina. And of course, the U.S. rejected it and, kind of made it like this, that Cuba was just trying to spread propaganda, blah, blah, blah. But there was a speech at that time, or just after that, by Fidel, where he says, this isn't about propaganda or whatever. It's, he compares it to seeing a cruise ship off the coast of Cuba filled with people from the United States drowning. And he's like, how are we being stopped from going to help these people? And this is a quote from the speech. He says, "It hurts to think that maybe some of those desperate people trapped by the water and at death's door could have been saved." That's really what's at stake with these, when these, capitalist governments, whether in the U.S. or Canada, refuse medical support just based on ideology.
They'd rather their own people die.
Yeah.
And this again concerns the comparison I was speaking of before. Even domestically, where the U.S. is concerned, the capitalist approach is to see these health disasters and natural disasters and so on as opportunities for investment. And Fidel said at the time of Hurricane Katrina that others send money and perceive this in a charitable guise, whereas Cuba is offering to put boots on the ground. It's this qualitatively different approach.
It's the same with their hurricane response, right? Where how organized Cuba's hurricane response is, where they have the communities in defense of the revolution.
neighborhood committees.
Basically going door to door, making sure that everybody is taken care of, everybody has a way out, and those people who need extra help, whether they have mobility issues or whatever the case may be, they are taken care of. Whereas in the U.S., in Canada, it's much the same, although we don't have the same level of problems with hurricanes. But you fend for yourself, and that's why people die during these hurricanes. Completely preventable deaths.
Well, obviously there are geographical affinities here as well, and Cuba has experience to lend the United States in hurricane response, being repeatedly assailed by hurricanes even seasonally. This is something we should flag for a future episode, is Cuba's climate plan and climate response, because they are on an ecological precipice and they're facing effects of catastrophic climate change, even though their own industrial activity has contributed very little to that global condition. And they've really taken it in hand, and they're doing remarkable things. That's something we should talk about in the future.
Yeah.
In any case, I think of how blighted New Orleans is now, and the tremendous racial disparity preceding that particular disaster, and only exacerbated by the hurricane and its improper management. I think about the respects in which the advanced capitalist countries have underdeveloped themselves. I want to loop back to something that you were saying, Rob, when Samantha was talking about Yes, I Can and Cuba's literacy programs. I'm sure we've all seen these staggering numbers that something like 21% of the United States is functionally illiterate. That's difficult to believe.
Yeah, it's really high.
And I think that will be a signature outcome of the Trump era in particular, is to deepen this disparity after this style of government by targeted neglect. I think tangentially back to a U.S.-Cuba normalization conference that I attended in New York some years ago that was all about climate change. And there was a speaker from the Bronx who was talking about how it is appreciably hotter there owing to the built environment and the uneven development of the city than in lower Manhattan. And with some of the poorest postal codes in the country, she quite confidently pursued a co-theory between the Bronx and Cuba based on their mutual blockading by the United States. That is, in a domestic blockade.
I saw something similar in, it was a city in Arizona where they showed how areas of the city itself are hotter, economically, but it's based on the fact that there's less greenery, there's less trees to for shade, there's less there's more concrete that absorbs the heat, etc. But just going back to what you were saying about the abysmal literacy rate in the United States, this is from a global article from a while back, but it says, according to Statistics Canada, about 53% of New Brunswickers are functionally illiterate. That means many people in the province can read street signs, write their own names, but have trouble with reading beyond that. That's in New Brunswick. Over half of the people in New Brunswick are functionally illiterate. Speaking of capitalism underdeveloping itself,
I wouldn't be surprised if Nova Scotia is not too far off from that too. I have a lot of family in Nova Scotia, but economically, it's like the Rust Belt of Canada, kind of.
I mean, this isn't really what we're talking about, but even in I remember in Winnipeg seeing a study that the life expectancy between the North Point Douglas area, which is a high percentage of Indigenous people, versus Fort Garry, which is sort of like a suburban area, the life expectancy is a difference of 20 years in the same city.
My God.
And this is in so many ways I meant what I said, that it is a style of government by neglect, but that doesn't mean that it isn't designed. It doesn't mean it isn't a designed outcome. If you talk about like the urban planning that results in the South Bronx being so much hotter because of the way that concrete without green space and so on traps heat, and because of various things like this, it's poor design, but it's really a persistent misallocation of resources that is in some respects targeted and prejudicial. So this is an everyday urban experience, and also an experience of rural locales and so on. If we're talking about New Brunswick and other places in the United States and Canada, these are everyday experiences that working people have here that I think we can draw upon in order to communicate the deep affinities that people ought to have with Cuba.
Primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.